I'm Beth Perrell. I'm speaking with Pat Rose, aquatic biologist and executive director of the Save the Manatee Club. Once again, we want to get an update on what is happening with the manatee. And I think we'll begin, if you don't mind, with just an update on the significant mortality issues that the manatee population has been facing. Where do we stand now?
Well, the total mortality as of a couple of days ago was 984. So we're really approaching that 1,000 manatees dead this year. That's certainly going to go higher than that before the year's out, hopefully not too much more. The good news is the rate of mortality has slowed substantially compared to what it was in the first several months of the year. So that's the good part. But manatees, of course, besides the starvation problem in the Indian River Lagoon that killed so many manatees, we really expect that's going to be a major problem again this coming winter. So a lot of effort is going in to try to head that off, to learn more about what can be done. And within limits, everything will be done that can be done. We're working with a lot of partners to try to make it safer for manatees, but it's going to be tough no matter what. On top of that, we've got red tide on the west coast of Florida right now that's killed almost 50 manatees this year, and it's still there in a number of the counties around Hillsborough, Pinellas, Sarasota, Manatee, and even a little farther south. And there's even some signs of some minor fish kills and things going a little north of Hillsborough County. And of course, the stresses from watercraft injuries and death and mortality, that is also quite significant this year as well. So they're facing some pretty tough odds, but I think everybody's understanding that it was very premature to downlisted manatees from endangered to threatened in 2017. We're hoping that this is serving as a wake-up call, and we can all work together to make it a safer place, not only for manatees, but a better place for all the species that depend on our aquatic ecosystems.
So the fall migration of the manatee is happening soon, I imagine. And will that mean with an increased population, they're going to, with the diminished resources, there might be too little to go around?
Well, certainly for that area around Brevard County and the Titusville power plant, there is not nearly enough vegetation. Once they focus in and come to the warm water and stay there for the colder parts of the winter, there is no forage in a very short amount area to that. So they're going to have to come in better shape than they did last year. And that's what we're struggling right now to get a better handle on. As recently as yesterday, we were working with some other partners, including Mote Marine Laboratory, University of Florida, to go out and spot where the manatees were, to actually send out a crew with a drone and try to get a better idea of what the health conditions were of those manatees. There are going to be more efforts going on. USGS is going to have health assessments where they're actually going to capture some manatees, draw blood and check on them and so forth. That won't happen though till December. So we're trying to, before they even aggregate, we're trying to get an idea out in the, say, the Indian River, within other sections of that surrounding habitat, see how the manatees are doing. There were about 250 manatees still in that region. We think they're all a little thin, but we need to get better information.
And meantime, to the locations where you said there's problem with algal blooms, what can you really do in a situation like that? There's no way, is there, to wave the manatee off of the area?
There's really not. We know many of them will come back and could be in the same dilemma they were last year, in that they know it's warm there. They're going to have to make a choice between staying warm and going without food. On the other hand, we hope that more and more of those would know where more than one place to stay warm is, and they'll keep moving to another power plant further south, such as Riviera Beach, or to Fort Lauderdale area. There's 2 power plants there. So a number of those will know that and they'll move, but there's pretty sparse vegetation throughout the Indian River Lagoon. It's just especially bad in the northern areas, where it's lost about 96% of the total biomass of the seagrass. There are signs that manatees are feeding on some of the macroalgae now. We hope that they're going to do okay with that. It's still a little bit unclear. We're seeing some signs that some of those manatees are floating kind of high caudally or in the rear end a little high, but they're staying in balance. So it doesn't look like they're in immediate distress, but it's likely that eating a different diet, which is not as nutritious and compatible as the seagrasses. But the manatees are, they're doing everything they can to maintain their health. It's just going to be a really tough winter again.
what they're used to eating, the grasses, you're saying they're replacing that with something that's got to lead to some sort of discomfort for them as well.
Well, in fact, it is. So it's likely increasing even the amount of gas that builds up and so forth as they're trying to, the bacteria, and have to adjust to help digest the products that they're taking in. In some cases, they may be even sifting through some other sort of almost detrital material to get what they can from it, because there's just so little of the best forage for them available. And we need to know more about that. And I'm a little uncomfortable that we don't know more yet, and we're striving to do that with our partners. And of course, the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership is really working hard. There have been 130 some manatees rescued this year. There are about, I think, 88 or so in captivity right now. We're working to find more space because undoubtedly there's going to need to be more manatees rescued. And of course, that's the need for people to be watching out for them and be able to report that to the Fish and Wildlife Commission. And so that, and again, we're not at a good sense that we have enough space yet, so still working on that. And there's a possibility, and it's being worked on, that we may try to supplementally feed with the approval of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Fish and Wildlife Commission. That's not been determined yet. There's some experimenting that likely will happen, and then we'll have to see that. At that point in time, the public will be informed on what's happening, but in the meantime, people should not be going out and trying to feed them. That's not a good thing for them to do on their own, but there could be a point in time when folks would be asked to sort of help and chip in for that, if that's what the decision is.
Underscoring, don't try to feed them, but certainly if we see a manatee that seems to be in distress, we should alert someone.
Oh, absolutely. So it's really the 888-404-3922 call. That's the Fish and Wildlife Commission. They will put them in contact, ask them questions, the location, the conditions and so forth. And then if that's going to be very essential, and like I said, 130 some manatees have been rescued already over the course of the year. We expect that many more will need to be. And that's sort of a given that that's going to happen. The feeding, we're not sure yet, but the rescue needs, but we still need more space, and we need, support for those partners that are helping to provide that acute care for the manatees.
Tell me a little bit about the scientists, the biologists, all the partners that are working on this issue, because you probably have, more resources from the state perhaps to work on this problem, but there's only so many of you, right? Right.
So it's sort of divided up, if you will. I've talked a lot about the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership. So that's both the federal government, Fish and Wildlife Service, Fish and Wildlife Commission. It's the zoos and aquariums that have been able to hold and to treat manatees. And it's the state parks that will help with that, like Homosassa Springs State Park. Then there's a research side of that. So that's everything from the federal government with the United States Geological Survey. Fish and Wildlife Commission has many different people that are working on that as well, trying to learn as much as we can about what the manatees are going to, keeping track of them. We have joined with both Mote Marine Laboratory and the Fish and Wildlife Commission for extra flights. We're also the group I mentioned before with UF and also Mote, looking at supporting with other nonprofits to get out there and use drone technology to try to better assess what the relative health of manatees are and develop actual methodologies to sort of standardize that going forward. And then there's Clearwater Marine Aquarium. They're both there to help track and tag manatees that are released from the MRP process. And then they're going to be trying to expand their facilities as well. So they're another really important partner. And then the local governments. So Brevard County, Broward County, other local governments have also been assisting with this because the needs are so great. You need to simultaneously take care of the ailing manatees, but also try to collect the data that you need to determine the best course of action come winter. Right. So those are those immediate problems we're trying to deal with. But at the same time, we're coordinating with the partners like the Fish and Wildlife Service, emphasizing their need to actually reinitiate consultation with the Environmental Protection Agency to bring in the Endangered Species Act. Under Section 7, there's a process for consultation. And it may be that higher standards are needed in order to help recover the ecosystems in terms of the water quality, because the rules and laws that exist today just aren't doing it. We're seeing this continue to decline, not only in the Indian River Lagoon, but we're seeing problems in Biscayne Bay, Tampa Bay again, Charlotte Harbor, Sarasota. It's really, there's signs that problems from too much nutrient loading, which led to the algal blooms and the change in species diversity from seagrass communities towards the macroalgae. That's happening in other places. It's just not to the extent of what happened in the Indian River Lagoon. So we really need an overhaul of our laws that protect our water quality, if you will, so that we're not seeing more places have these collapses and harmful algal blooms one after another.
Would you go ahead and give just a little bit more of the history as relates to the downlisting of the manatee, which you said was premature?
Right. So in 2017, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service downlisted manatees from endangered status to threatened status. In doing that, they were promising that they wouldn't change the amount of effort they put into it, the funding, the staffing, and things like that. But the reality was they did. And you have to understand that the problems that I've been discussing today were all pretty much known that they were getting worse. We did have decades of good recovery and very substantial help for the manatees and so forth, but that really started coming to an end around 2010. And by 2011, we were seeing major algal blooms in the Indian River Lagoon. And then, of course, between 2011 and 2017, when they were downlisted, that situation was getting worse. And we were having year after year of record-breaking watercraft mortality. We were having years of 300 manatees killed by red tide. And so there were massive problems already well underway when they decided to kind of declare premature victory and downlist manatees to threaten. And even the scientific peer reviewers who they sent out to ask them for their comments said that this was premature and that there were signs that the threats and risks were increasing. They were not under control and they were likely to get worse. And of course they have. So now we're hoping they've really woken up and understood that that was a mistake. There are even efforts that have drawn attention to this mistake by Congress actually looking at getting involved to congressionally upgrade manatees back to endangered, and because we really don't want the Fish and Wildlife Service to stop right now and worry about what you call them. We want them to really engage on these recovery efforts, do everything they can now to make up for the sort of neglect that occurred in those several years time period when we were warning them that these problems were getting worse. And so we want to work together, and we are working with them, encouraging them to do more. And that's why the consultation with the EPA is important, that the Fish and Wildlife Service is the one that needs to ask for that to happen. And then on top of that, we've engaged with the Fish and Wildlife Service to upgrade the critical habitat status for manatees, which includes the Indian River Lagoon, because we actually got them to agree back in 2010 that that should be done, but here 11 years later, they still hadn't done it.
When we think about this situation, and you're talking about the ecosystems and the environments of the manatee, there are other creatures, wildlife, et cetera, that are impacted too, right?
Yes, there absolutely are. There are certainly many other species that depend on the seagrasses and healthy ecosystems and the water quality being what it needs to be. Being that manatees are vegetarians, that's their whole diet is really dependent upon the seagrasses and to some degree the algae and so forth too, the larger types of algae. Species like dolphins, though, are going to be impacted ultimately because it's affecting the number of fish in the nursery grounds for the fisheries, the rays, and just there's other myriad of species that also depend on those healthy seagrass systems are going to also be affected by such great losses.
Talked in the summer, and you were talking about the loss of the grass. There was efforts underway to plant more. I imagine that takes time to grow. What is, have the resources increased at all in terms of the grass?
So for the short term, within the Indian River Lagoon, which folks has gone, no, but there still are efforts going on to improve water quality, but they're just incremental increases in that. There's been no sign that we have any significant amount of regrowth. There are sparse amounts of seagrass being found amongst some of the macroalgae that can help bind the subsoils and sort of set the stage for regrowth. There are projects actively underway to replant freshwater vegetation in some of the tributaries to the Indian River Lagoon, and that's already in progress. There's other work to acquire for example, a spring system on the west coast of Florida that has been needed for manatees and warm water habitat. Because when the legislature passed the $8 million funding for restoration, they included warm water habitat protection too, because that's such a severe future problem that we could be seeing thousands of manatees lost in the future if those artificial sources go away before we protected the natural warm water sources like springs. But it's going to be a long road of recovery before we see the actual seagrass themselves rebound to the levels that can sustain all of the species that depend on those communities. And that's going to mean improving water quality very dramatically. And that's why I mentioned the importance of the reinitiating consultation with the EPA, because we need really higher standards. We need greater adverse consequences for those who don't live up to their permit conditions. And we need permit conditions that are stronger and more protective of the water quality than we have today.
I want to ask you a non-scientific, non-advocacy question. What is the one thing or many things that you have seen over these past few months in dealing with this issue that you said to yourself, if people could just see what I'm seeing right now? Has anything like that occurred?
So I go to a couple of places. The negative one, if people could see just how horribly sickened and debilitated those manatees were and how they got to that point of suffering before they died, they would just, they would be like, I'm saying, I'm mad, I'm sad, but then I want to do work every day that I can. In fact, that all came when I was scheduled to retire. After I turned 70 this year, was looking at retirement, but seeing what was going on, I knew I couldn't do that. I knew I had to recommit myself and our organization to making sure we could be there for the manatees. The good thing that I'm seeing is, in fact, there's so many people willing to help and get involved, and particularly the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership. That's something that people need to know more about, and I think they learn more, they will want to help even more. But beyond that, they need to know that their own quality of life is going to suffer as well. The manatees are sort of the early warning system here. And what the fish kills and all those other things that have come behind that, and they're going to spread to more places. So I hope they'll want to step up today and help, but they stay engaged in the long run to make it better. As long as, it's going to take a comprehensive effort. That's started, people are aware, but it's got to stay there even if we start to see better numbers and so forth. We can't then decide we're going to go about our normal business, because this is a problem that is getting worse, and it's going to get much worse if we don't make a sort of 180-degree turnaround and pay attention to not allowing our septic discharges into the water systems. And we've got to increase the way that we clean up our wastewater. We've got to do less fertilizing on our lawns and our agriculture and the rest of that. We can't ignore it, or this will get much worse.
And why don't you take a moment as well to give those tips for how to interact with the manatees? Again, the fall migration is beginning. We all want to go take a look, and but what do we do to keep them safe?
Well, we're almost at November 1st. So by the middle of November, most of the manatees will be moving to other warm water sources. So they'll be migrating from the tributaries and other streams and things, making their way to either the artificial power plants for the warm water or to our natural springs. And so boaters really need to be watching out for them and paying attention to the course, the speed zones and slowing down. But even when they're not in a speed zone, they should be looking for signs that manatees are in the waterway. And if you see a manatee, of course, its nose come up, that's pretty easy to see. But when they're swimming, they'll actually leave little flat spots on top of the water that'll be sequentially. We call them manatee footprints. You can know that somewhere in front of that, there's a manatee there, or maybe many manatees. You need to look for abnormal signs. For example, if you see a manatee that's beached itself, or there's one that is swimming oddly on its side, or it's not balanced in the water, or too high in the water, breathing more rapidly. A manatee shouldn't breathe more than, say, once every 5 minutes or so. And they can even hold their breath much longer. But if they're breathing once every minute or two, they should call that in, because there is a problem with that manatee. So and again, we have a network that can respond for rescues and treat them. So it really takes the public getting involved. There was a great example this week on the West Coast with the red tide. An individual reported a manatee that was struggling. They called it in. Fish and Wildlife Commission gave them permission to help hold the manatee's head above the water. That manatee was saved and brought in. It's likely going to survive. Had the person not engaged in that, but with permission, then that manatee would likely have died within the next half hour.
Is there anything you'd like to say about the Save the Manatee Club?
Well, this is Save the Manatee Club's 40th anniversary. And of course, we were started by Jimmy Buffett and Governor Graham. We're so indebted to both of them, having the vision to know that much more needed to be done, not only to save manatees, but the aquatic ecosystems. And we hope to be around and needed for many years to come. But we would ultimately love to have put ourselves out of business. And even though things have gotten much better, you can see how they can go from much better to much worse. And so that vigilance, and that's what we have revitalized at the club as well. And so the volunteers that will come to us, the adoption of the manatees allow us to help manatees, whether it's supporting those that are being brought in and rescued and treated, or the science that goes behind the research at Blue Spring or other places. We want to be, as we have been, that voice for manatees since 1981. Our mission has just grown that much more because it has always been part of saving the aquatic ecosystem, but it's never been more relevant than it is right now. And so we've just encouraged, not just asking for money, I'm asking people, come to SaveTheManatee.org and learn about what's going on in terms of the seagrass losses, in terms of the algal blooms and the watercraft issues and those kinds of things. Engage through our action alert process. We'll help alert you to what's going on. We'll help you engage with your local government officials right up through the federal government. So we're thankful for all the support we've had, but when we know our mission needs to carry on.
Thanks again for this update. Any final thoughts, anything that we failed to mention?
I think we've mentioned it, but I'll just say again, if you see a sick or injured manatee that's struggling, report that, the 888-404-3922, because help can, be coming, and it's making a huge difference. And if you're asked to support, come along the way, and there's a way you can engage, then please do that too, because your help is needed.
Pat Rose is an aquatic biologist and executive director of the Save the Manatee Club. Online, SaveTheManatee.org. I'm Beth Perrell.